The thing that strikes you about the suffering of Brainerd is not simply the severity of it, but the consistency of it. He always suffered. From the time he was a student, he never had relief for any significant amount of time. It was a relentless sickness. And he pressed on in his work. Second, Brainerd struggled with relentlessly recurring depression. He came to understand this a little, I think. Edwards said that at first he attributed far too much to spiritual desertion and far too little to the disease of melancholy. That's their phrase, the disease of melancholy. And so his later judgments about what was happening in his blackest moods were a little more balanced than his earlier ones. But it was a horrendous thing, nevertheless. And this was his greatest torment, not the tuberculosis. He did say that he detected a very profound difference in the melancholy after his conversion and the melancholy before his conversion, as though a great rock had been inserted underneath his life, so that he never despaired of the electing love of God after his conversion. A great gift to him in his darkest days. He would say repeatedly, "Black, God is gone, but I do not doubt His love." Things like that. A few words of his own to give you a flavor of what he experienced. Much of it was owing to his intense hatred for the remaining sin in his life. November 4:42. "'Tis distressing to feel in my soul that hell of corruption which still remains in me." And his sense of unworthiness was so intense that it sometimes just paralyzed him. January 23rd, 43. "Scarce ever felt myself so unfit to exist as now. I saw I was not worthy of a place among the Indians where I am going. None knows but those that feel it, what the soul endures that is sensibly shut out from the presence of God. Alas, 'tis more bitter than death." In fact, again and again he compared it to death, and I wrote down 22 places where he longed and pleaded that he would die. Sunday, February 3rd, 1745. "My soul remembered the wormwood and the gall, I might almost say the hell of Friday night last. And I was greatly afraid I should be obliged again to drink of that cup of trembling, which was inconceivably more bitter than death, and made me long for the grave unspeakably more than for hidden treasures." Sunday, 44, December 16. "Was so overwhelmed with dejection that I knew not how to live. I longed for death exceedingly. My soul was sunk in deep waters, and the floods were ready to drown me. I was so much oppressed that my soul was in a kind of horror." And what compounded this experience for Brainerd was that the depression began to infect and lame his devotional exercises and his ministry of preaching. March 9, 43. "Rode 16 miles to Montauk and had some inward sweetness on the road, but something of flatness and deadness after I came there and had seen the Indians. Withdrew and endeavored to pray, but found myself awfully deserted and left." It was immobilized sometime in his distresses. September 46. "Was scarce ever more confounded with a sense of my own unfruitfulness and unfitness of my work than now. Oh, what a dead, heartless, barren, unprofitable wretch did I now see myself to be. My spirits were so low, my bodily strength so wasted, that I could do nothing at all. At length, being much overdone, lay down on a buffalo skin and sweat much of the whole night." But Brainerd pressed on and did not quit. He never quit. Third, Brainerd struggled with loneliness. He tells of having to endure profane talk of strangers one night, April 43. Oh, I longed for some dear Christian who knew my distresses. A month later, he says, most of the talk I hear is either Highland Scotch or Indian. I have no fellow Christian to whom I might unbosom myself and lay open my spiritual sorrows, with whom I might take sweet counsel and conversation about the heavenly things and join in social prayer. In December 1745, he wrote a letter to Eleazar Wheelock. We'll come back to him in a minute. He founded another college under Brainerd's inspiration. He wrote, I doubt not by that time you have read my journal through, you'll be more sensible of the need I stand of a companion in travel than ever you were before. And I read 2 nights ago this quote that we all can empathize with. I think about, he didn't want just anybody. A horse wouldn't do, and a carnal Christian wouldn't do. He wanted a soul companion. He wrote, there are many with whom I can talk about religion, but alas, I find few with whom I can talk religion itself. But blessed be the Lord, there are some that love to feed on the kernel rather than the shell. He, in his last 19 weeks, was nursed by Jerusha Edwards. She was 17, and in all likelihood, it was a precious relationship. He speaks of an unparalleled, precious acquaintance. Never names him or her, but most people think that they did have a warm and spiritual relationship in those last days. Fourth, Brainerd struggled with immense external hardships as a missionary. In his first mission to County in 43, he said, I live poorly with regard to the comforts of life. Most of my diet consists of boiled corn, hasty pudding, etc. I lodge on a bundle of straw. My labor is hard and extremely difficult, and I have little experience of success to comfort me. In August of that year, he said, in this weak, W-E-A-K, in this weak state of body, I was not little distressed for want of suitable food, had no bread, nor could I get any. I am forced to go or stand 10 or 15 miles for all the bread I eat, and sometimes 'tis moldy and sour before I eat it, if I get any considerable quantity. But through divine goodness, I had some Indian meal, of which I made little cakes and fried them, yet felt contented with my circumstances and sweetly resigned to God. He was frequently lost in the woods. His horse, his car, broke down again and again. His horse would get poisoned. His horse got a broken leg. His horse got stolen. All of our car experiences happened to a missionary back then as well. With this lung condition, picture yourself now trying to be warmed in the winter in a hut with a fire. Again and again, the smoke would so fill the room, he would almost lose his breath. He would have to go outside in the cold. And he said, I would either be dying of cold outside or I would be smothering in the smoke inside. And he's alone, totally alone, 15 miles from anybody in the wilderness with tuberculosis and smoke filling his house and 29 degrees outside or whatever. The struggle with external hardships was not the worst struggle, but it was an amazing one, and he resigned himself to it like this. Here's what he said. Such fatigues and hardships as they serve to wean me more from the earth, and I trust will make heaven sweeter. Formerly, when I was thus exposed to cold, rain, etc., I was ready to please myself with the thoughts of enjoying a comfortable house, a warm fire, and other outward comforts. But now these have less place in my heart through the grace of God, and my eye is more to God for comfort. In this world I expect tribulation, and it does not now as formerly appear a strange thing to me. I don't in such seasons of difficulty, flatter myself that it will be better hereafter, but rather think how much worse it could be, how much greater trials others of God's children have endured, and how much greater are perhaps those reserved for me. Blessed be God that He makes, or He is, the comfort to me under my sharpest trials, and scarce ever lets these thoughts be attended with terror or melancholy, but they are attended frequently with great joy. So in spite of the terrible external hardships, Brainerd pressed on, and indeed often flourished at the moment when he suffered most. Fifth, Brainerd struggled with a bleak outlook on nature. A bleak outlook on nature. And we will forgive him for this quickly, I think, because it is hard to look at a rose when you're spitting blood. But it is a great tragedy that he did not have more of Jonathan Edwards' eyes. He never said one thing about the beauty of nature. Never once did he talk of a sunset, a sunrise, a bird, a bee, a flower, and he lived among them, always. Edwards, on the contrary, would take walks and horse rides in the woods. He would see the excellency of God everywhere, echoes of glory in everything from a spider's web to the sun. Brainerd had not 1 ounce of this appreciation for nature. It was a howling wilderness to him, constant misery as far as he was concerned. And the great tragedy of that is that the burden that he bore blinded him, it seemed, from the antidote to the burden. God has appointed nature as a healing means for our souls. You know, one of the ironies here, too, is that Edwards did not see this, as far as I can tell. Edwards complimented Brainerd for not having an imagination, because it was imaginations that were wrecking the Great Awakening. You see, enthusiasm, as it was called, excessive emotionalism, was rooted in imagining things that had no grace in them. And Edwards was just fighting and fighting against people who say, "Oh, I saw the Lord. His arms were open wide to me. He was enfolding me in His arms. I am His child." And they live like the devil. Edwards says, "This is no true grace. Your visions are nothing." And so he warmly congratulates Brainerd for having no warm imagination. All of Brainerd's thought was rooted in a spiritual apprehension of glory. Well, there is a plus and a minus to not having an imagination, I'll tell you. Far healthier would have been the counsel of Spurgeon. To sit long in one posture, poring over a book or driving a quill, is in itself a taxing of nature. But add to this a badly ventilated chamber, a body which has been long without muscular exercise, and a heart burdened with many cares, and we have all the elements for preparing a seething cauldron of despair. Especially in the dim months of fog. Nature outside his window is calling him to health and beckoning him to joy. He who forgets the humming of the bees among the heather, the cooing of the wood pigeons in the forest, the song of birds in the woods, the rippling of the rills among the rushes, the sighing of the wind among the pines, needs not wonder if his heart forgets to sing and his soul grows heavy. Nobody told him to open the eyes of his eyes. At least he didn't seem to hear, or he didn't record if they did. But I repeat, we will quickly forgive Brainerd. because it is hard to see when you're suffering. It is hard. And yet, let us consider the lilies, brothers. It was not merely Spurgeon who set us on this quest to open our eyes. Consider the lilies. Sixth, Brainerd struggled to love the Indians. He struggled to love the Indians. If love is known by sacrifice, he loved them. If love is also known by heartfelt, warm affection and compassion, he struggled to love them. Felt some compassion for souls and mourned. I had no more. I feel much more kindness, meekness, gentleness, and love toward all mankind than ever. He really did get great success in this from time to time. Felt much sweetness and tenderness in prayer. Especially my whole soul seemed to love my worst enemies and was enabled to pray for those that are strangers and enemies to God with great degree of softness and pathetic fervor. But at other times, he was empty of affection and compassion for souls, and he expresses his guilt for that he had no more ardency and so little desire for their salvation. 44, November 2nd, about noon, rode up to the Indians, and while going could feel no desire for them, and even dreaded to say anything to them. So Brainerd struggled with the rise and fall of love in his heart. He loved, but he longed to love more. I love them, Father. Help thou my unlove. And seventh, he struggled to stay true to his calling as a missionary. He struggled to stay true. Remember now, he was expelled from college, cut off from the pastoral ministry, bowed to what he believed was the call of God to missions after that breaking off of his pastoral journey, and then, surprisingly, was offered several pastorates along the way. Good ones, too. He was offered the church at Millington near his home in Haddam in 1744, and he turned it down and prayed that God would send forth laborers to the vineyard. And then he was offered the most lucrative parish in New York, Long Island, East Hampton. Jonathan Edwards says, it is the fairest, pleasantest town on the whole island and one of its largest and most wealthy parishes. That's a quote. And Brainerd wrote on Thursday, April 5th, resolved to go on still with the Indian affair, if divine providence permitted, although before felt some inclination to go to East Hampton, where I was solicited to go. Now, mark this choice. He's spitting blood almost every day. He is alone. He doesn't have adequate food or shelter. The Indians are often unresponsive. He is offered a parish, his lifelong dream, or his dream since he was converted. And he says no. There were a lot of other opportunities too. He wrote, I could have no freedom in the thought of any other circumstances or business in my life. All my desire was the conversion of the heathen, and all my hope was in God. God does not suffer me to please or comfort myself with hopes of seeing friends, returning to my dear acquaintance. Who is that? And enjoying worldly comforts. He has basically surrendered them. He probably knows he's a dying man. Well, those are the 7 struggles that I wanted to mention, and now I want to turn to how he pressed on in these struggles. So we began with introduction to his life, turned to the struggles, and now thirdly to his pressing on. I personally think the reason that David Brainerd's life has exerted the power that it has is because, in spite of his struggles, he never gave up. It's that simple. He was consumed with a passion to finish his race, honor his master, spread the kingdom, and advance in holiness. Absolutely consumed. He could not relent from his pursuit of the kingdom, the honor of his master, and his own holiness. He had an unswerving allegiance to the cause of Christ, so that I think we can all empathize with Henry Martyn when, after reading him in Cambridge in 1802, he said, "I long to be like him. Long to be like him." In spite of all the strangeness and unhealth and suffering, there is something in this man that makes us say, I must be like this. I want to be like this. Brainerd called this passion to finish his race and not turn back a pleasing pain. He said, "When I really enjoy God, I feel my desires of Him the more insatiable, and my thirstings after holiness the more unquenchable. Oh, for holiness! Oh, for more of God in my soul! Oh, this pleasing pain! It makes my soul press after God. Oh, that I might not loiter on my heavenly journey. Oh, that I might not loiter on my heavenly journey." He was utterly gripped by the apostolic admonition, "Redeem the time, for the days are evil. Do not grow weary in well-doing, for in due time you will reap if you do not faint. Abound in the work of the Lord." He is an outfleshing of the pursuit of those apostolic commands with incredible devotion and single-minded fervor. April 1747, his last year. "Oh, I long to fill the remaining moments, all for God. Though my body was so feeble and wearied with preaching and much private conversation, yet I wanted to sit up all night to do something for God. To God, the giver of these refreshments, be glory forever and ever. Amen." February 21, 46. "My soul was refreshed and comforted. I could not bless God. I could not but bless God, who had enabled me in some good measure to be faithful in the day past. Oh, how sweet it is to be spent and worn out for God." Among the means that Brainerd used in pursuing God in this way was prayer, fasting, study, and writing. Let me say a word about each of these. Prayer. What a man of prayer. Again and again you read, "Spent the day in prayer for the Indians." Or, "Set aside 6 times today prayer." Or, "Met with nearby family or friend to pray with them for the concerns of the kingdom." He prayed for His holiness. He prayed for the conversion of the Indians. He prayed, perhaps above all, for the advancement of the kingdom. "Oh God, let your kingdom come in New England." He prayed and prayed that God's cause would advance. What a spirit of prayer this man had. He was visiting the home of a friend one time, and he just went off by himself often to pray. He would seek out a little place, a room or outside. And this is what he wrote. "I continued wrestling with God in prayer for my dear little flock here, and more especially for the Indians elsewhere, as well as for dear friends in one place and another, till it was bedtime, and I feared I should hinder the family, etc. But oh, with what reluctancy did I find myself obliged to consume time in sleep." With what reluctancy I went to bed when I wanted to keep on praying. And he fasted and fasted and fasted. Again and again you read, fasted and prayed. before the day, fasted every time he needed guidance, when he switched fields, or that summer after he was kicked out of school, fasting and fasting for guidance, for spiritual depth, for usefulness. And then he wrote a letter at the end of his life to young ministers, urging them to build into your lives fasting and prayer because of the spiritual benefits he had received by it. Here's what Edwards wrote about this experience. Among all the many days he spent in secret fasting and prayer, and that he gives account of in his diary, there is scarce an instance of one, but what was either attended or soon followed with apparent success, and a remarkable blessing in special incomes and consolations of God's Spirit, and very often before the day was ended. In other words, Edwards says, as he documents it, that almost every day that he fasted, something good happened in his life. Thirdly, besides prayer and fasting, here was, in a sense, a very frustrated scholar, which every pastor is almost. Every pastor wants more time to read, as far as I know. I've never met one who says, I read too much, or I get too much time to read. Right. But Brainerd was an extraordinary mind. He was a genius, probably, from his language learning and his bent towards study, and he studied much. Picture him studying. He built 4 little huts in his life. Each place where he worked, he built with his own hands a little hut. And in the hut you have a candle and a fireplace. No electricity, no computers and word processors, no pencils, and no paper of any significant amount. 45, December 20th, I spent much of the day in writing, but was enabled to intermix prayer with my studies. January 7, 44, spent this day in seriousness with steadfast resolutions for God and a life of mortification, studied closely till I felt my bodily strength fail. December 20th, 42, spent this day in prayer and reading and writing, and enjoyed some assistance, especially in correcting some thoughts on a certain subject. He was constantly writing. Now, one of the reasons this is significant is because we don't know what he wrote. Only the diaries and the journal are preserved of Brainerd. There aren't any other manuscripts except letters. And yet he was constantly writing theological things, and we don't have any of them. He was writing for himself, just like you all should do. Publishing is not as significant as writing. You should all write because you clarify things when you write. You go deeper when you write. You get order when you write. You grow in facility with language when you write. He said, was most of the day employed in writing on a divine subject, was frequent in prayer. Another time, spent most of the time in writing on a sweet divine subject. That's what we just don't have any of. Another time, was engaged in writing again almost the whole day. Again, rose early in the morning by candlelight, some considerable time, spent most of the day and wrote. Another time, towards night, enjoyed some of the clearest thoughts on a divine subject that ever I remember to have had upon any subject whatsoever, and spent 2 or 3 hours writing them. So here's a man with absolutely none of your benefits, none of your comforts, none of your advantages. Spitting blood every day, agonizing in his breast, not adequate food, Indians clamoring for his attention, totally alone, writing, not for publication. And I commend it to you.